Good afternoon. Hello. Okay, I think I know this. Exactly. Okay, so let me go over the syllabus first, and then if you have any questions, I can answer that and then start teaching. So now I have not decided. So anyway, I'll update about the office. We have two. So they will also update their office hours once they decide that. And the prerequisite for this course is 350. Actually just a continuation of what you learned in 350. In 350 we teach basic computer organization, how computers work, instructions and architecture, etc. Here the focus is, in 350 the focus was primarily on getting correct implementation of hardware. In 446, our focus is on, we have to still implement it correctly, but the focus is primarily on high performance. But we will also talk about low power consumption, higher reliability, things like that. And the textbook is the book by Hennessy and Patterson. There are different editions of this book, unlike some other textbooks where there is not really a big difference between editions. This is at least one book where I think there is a significant amount of change going from one edition to other, and primarily because the topic of computer architecture is constantly evolving one as hardware technology changes, etc. But the good thing is, I think it's the PDF is easily available, so you should be able to get the PDF for that. Now, in terms of editions, I checked the fifth one. Probably there is not a big difference between fifth and sixth, but fourth one, yes, there is big difference in the coverage of topics, etc. Okay. But anyway, given that the PDF is easily available, that should not be a big deal getting the sixth edition. So I'm planning to distribute the course grade with this breakup, homework 20%, exams. I'm planning on having 2 exams, non-cumulative second exam. So approximately half of the portions would be in the first exam and the other half would be in the second exam. Then I guess that's it. In terms of coverage for 646 also, what we do in 446 in the appendix of the book, of this book. And so in 646, for instance, we would go into other topics. So here we'll try to address these topics. Now, I'm not sure how much we'll be able to get to this, but we'll definitely talk about multi-core systems, etc. Very detailed treatment. That is covered in the graduate level for 646. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you know what approximately the exams will be by any chance?
As I mentioned, about half of the material would be in the midterm. So usually that would be kind of towards the later part of October. And the second exam, I have usually been doing that in the last week, but I'm open to, I usually ask the class if people are okay with that, because the second exam is not a longer exam, it's still 1 hour 15 minutes, so Okay, this then. Also, about the course, I know there are some people in the waiting list. Uh, we got an email saying if there are any references to waiting list to send them back to the undergrad office. So I do not have the ability or the power to get you from the waiting list. If any of you is in the waiting list, you need to talk to the EC undergraduate office. And also, in the syllabus, we got an email saying to include some stuff about coding. I have not done that, so I just update the syllabus with that. And probably you also received an email with the same information. Okay, I guess we'll start. The first chapter is an introductory chapter. Uh, we actually introduce what we call quantitative computer architecture until this book came along, the first edition, in the 1980s. Computer architecture was a different field, the way it was taught, etc. Um, it would be taught with saying, okay, we need more, or this technique is slow, so we would do this, and that would give speed up. Or this thing is bad because it takes up too much memory, so we do this like that, without trying to quantify the improvement that is obtained. With this book, this topic of quantitative analysis came into the picture. But unlike other fields in computer engineering or electrical engineering, there is really not that much of quantitative thing that we can do in computer design, mainly because there are just so many hardware parameters, and trying to model all that using mathematical equations is very hard. So by quantitative analysis, we generally mean doing some simulation-based studies and taking measurements about how much execution time it takes, things like that. So in this chapter, we do talk a lot about quantitative design. Okay, now, so computer architecture deals with computer organization and the instruction set architecture. And there are so many things that affect these. Like operating system, that's covered in 447. Then we don't really do much of software compilers. I believe we have a course on compilers. I don't remember the number. Programming languages that we don't really cover, that's more computer science. Parallelism, we do talk about some types of parallelism in this course, we do talk a lot about technology and its impact, etc. So that's where this it's too dense slide. Okay. This is mainly for just information purpose, to get an idea where things are headed. And on the x-axis, we have the years in a linear scale, and in the y-axis, it is logarithmic scale. So, and this is trying to plot performance. And you can see overall, it's more or less a linear curve here, which means overall, because this is logarithmic, it is exponential increase in performance. So that's starting from somewhere in the 1970s. So the improvement was about 25% per year increase, then went up, then again tapered like that. This is talking about single processor performance. And the industry moved to multi-core systems, and now we see more and more multi-core or even many-core systems. Now, this is sometimes called Moore's law. It's not really a law like you learn in chemistry, like Charles' law, Moore's law, like that. But this is more like an observation that Gordon Moore, was one of the co-founders of Intel. He observed in the 1960s that performance would increase approximately, or it would double approximately every 2 years. So that he made a prediction at that time, and so it has been actually keeping up with that, except what we reached here, single processor or single core performance was kind of tapering off. So, but with multi-core, it's again going like that. Why are we talking about this? That is because when a company is trying to make a new processor, it does take some amount of time. So if you start a new design here, it takes about it takes about 2 to 4 years. If it's something radically new, then it takes more time, because it takes more time to make sure the design bugs are all clear and things like that. So let's say today we have 100 billion transistors. We have 100 billion transistors in a single chip. We need to have some idea where things would be 4 years later in order to do a good design. Otherwise, if we assume today's budget, make a design, then a competitor would perform better because they plan better. So we need to have an idea, just basic hardware. same way we have to have some idea of where the software is heading. What type of applications are likely to be more popular, say 4 years later, and what type of computations would be needed by the software 4 years later. So those kind of things are important to build a successful computer. So that's what I was saying in 350. Our focus was just on somehow taking an instruction set architecture and building hardware right and making sure it executes. But now the focus is different in this course because we want to look at all these aspects. Okay, so again talking about different trends, also the type of computing itself is changing because application change, mobile computing, cloud computing, all of these are becoming more and more popular. So we have to also consider that. Previously, when we talk about computer architecture, we would only talk about just the laptop or desktop, and that's it. But future other devices may become more important. And one of the things we'll be talking about a lot is parallelism. And we will talk about these type of parallelism, like instruction level parallelism. Maybe you learned some of that in 350. Depending on who you took 350 with, you may have learned a little bit of instruction level parallelism, starting with pipelining. But there are a lot more things that can be done at the instruction level parallelism. Then you have, you can talk about parallelism at a higher granularity. Mainly, let's say I have a program Okay, let's consider this very short program. For convenience, I'm just using this notation so that we don't need to stick to MIPS or any specific instructions or architecture. It's pretty clear what this is doing. Instruction level parallelism means trying to execute more than one instruction in parallel. For instance, in this case, we cannot execute these two in parallel because a new R1 is being produced. That's needed here, so this has to be serialized. Now, can this be executed in parallel with this? Yes or no? These two.
both writing to the same register?
Yes.
Are you talking about the computations or the actual writing phase?
Yeah, I know. See, that's the problem with asking questions. Unless I'm completely clear. Yeah, I mean, the answer can be different. Yes, I mean, there is really no harm in doing these two add in parallel, but it's the writing part that will need to be serialized. Yes. But if this were something else, R6 or something, yes, we can do these two in parallel. Yeah.
Isn't parallel kind of when you actually do them at the same time almost? And then serial is like when you do them in sequence?
Yeah, yeah. Serial means yes, doing in sequence. Parallel, yes, we try to overlap. Now, as we saw, we cannot completely overlap the execution of these two because that would mean you end up writing this R1 before it's read. Yeah. But what we will see or in this course would be techniques to do these two in parallel.
Right to the same
Completely
register at the
parallel.
same time?
Yeah. Huh?
Right to the same register in parallel, you're saying?
We will not write to the same register. Instead, we will. Uh, there are multiple techniques. One of them is a software technique where an optimizing compiler would change this to a different register name. So that's called software register renaming. We'll also talk about a hardware scheme where the hardware will rename. And so it will not write to R1, but it will write to a different one. And it will try to remember the new mapping. So in the next instruction is needing R1. The hardware will remember that and modify this too. Yeah, so there are a lot of techniques under the belt of ILP, instruction level parallelism. Okay. Vector parallelism, that's a different type of parallel. It is still instruction level, but it's slightly different. I think it's easier to explain with a C code rather than assembly. Maybe for I. Okay, let's say we have a C code like that. How would this be translated to assembly? Most assembly languages would implement this. I'm not writing the full code, but we'll have some kind of a loop, some initialization, and then a loop where we would load this LW to some register. And then load this thing. Okay, and add. And then we have to store and then update the induction variable. check for some termination, and then branch not equal or that go. So this is usually how that C code will be translated to an assembly code. Is there parallelism here? Yeah.
Both 1 and 2 at the same time.
Yeah, you can do this. Anything else? Any other?
Could you unroll the loop?
Yeah, you have to unroll the loop. Without that, within this each loop body, yeah, I think the only parallelism probably is just you can do these two in parallel. But thereafter, it's kind of like quite sequential because you need these two here, you need that there, then you need to update the injection variable, check the injection variable, and then go back. However, with the second one there, vector architecture, it would do something like this. Okay, so before this, there will be some code to say how long this loop or the iteration count, which is 64. So that would need to be updated in some place, etc. And then just do this one. So we now have a different type of registers. This is called a vector register. Vector register means let's say these ones are like this. A register file. So this would be register 0, 1, 2, like that. In the vector register, we have so here each register can mainly it's just two-dimensional registers. Okay, I think this is better way of saying that. This is a single-dimensional address space like that. This is two-dimensional. You have like that, and vector register 0 actually has multiple registers with that. So you can express all that parallelism in this way. Now, how does this get parallelism? What happens is when it's trying to load this, it's loading 64, but not 64 in parallel. So it will load this one cycle, the first one, then the next cycle it will load the next one, then next one, like that. So you'll keep loading that. And then this will also be initiated. So in parallel, you have two streams of data being loaded and being added and being stored. So all of those can be done in parallel. That's what, in fact, many of those very high performance systems we call supercomputers, etc. They do that, and now many GPUs also have similar concepts, so vector architecture. So we look at that. Then thread level parallelism means instead of looking at close by instructions and looking for parallelism, we look at distant code. Kind of like if you're familiar with Java programming language, you can define multiple threads and spawn different threads that can go in parallel. And so that's the thread level parallelism. Or you can go even higher level, parallelism at transaction level or process level parallelism, etc. So main difference between, this is a very special purpose case. Main difference between ILP, TLP, etc. is the granularity at which parallelism is detected. And if you look at modern processors, they are actually doing everything. They are doing instruction level parallelism. Some are also doing vector and multi-cores, so using thread level parallelism and request level parallelism. This slide is there mainly for historic reasons. There were only very few parallel things, and so it was easy to bring everything under this taxonomy, but it's not really very relevant. But it's always thought. This taxonomy is looking at parallelism across two dimensions. One is across instruction, and the other is across data. So uniprocessor is single instruction operating on a single data item. Like this. Well, single data item means it is operating on two data, but really it's one set of data. Okay, so that's this one. Then multiple instructions operating on multiple data, that is thread level parallelism. And single instruction operating on multiple data, this is vector. So at that time, supercomputers are vectors, so he classified them like that. A single instruction operating on multiple data items. So it's SIMD. Then MIMD was parallel processors, where you had multiple processors connected together in some means. And this was uniprocessor. Okay, this was not there because it didn't make sense to have, that would be what? Multiple instructions operating on a single data. That didn't make sense. So there was nothing over there. So that's Flint's taxonomy, but it became difficult to, as ILP came along, where you're trying to do multiple things in parallel. Where would that fit? Either, it cannot go there. It's not really this. It has to go either there or here. But way he framed MIMD is in terms of multiple program counters moving along multiple parts of the program. So that was TLP, and this did not fit like that. It was more like, okay, you're trying to execute this, but also just kind of looking ahead a little bit to see, can I do this also? So it was not clear where that would fit in this picture. Okay. This is again more review, this slide. In 350 you studied instructions and architecture. What are some of the characteristics of successful instructions and architecture? First of all, what are some successful instructions and architectures out there? Successful means, I would say, many processors were made with that ISA.
Risk and sys.
Yeah, risk, that is more, you're talking about a whole ideology of how to design. But okay, let me give an example. One instructions in architecture, successful or not, would be MIPS. MIPS ISA, that's one ISA. Another one would be the ARM. Then x86, yeah, definitely x86. Then PowerPC from IBM, etc. So if you look at some of the successful ISAs, what is common about them? In terms of longevity, probably the one that has been around the longest was x86. So, x86 probably was, or nowadays called IA32. I know there, PowerPC, I'm not sure when it was introduced, but then ARM has different versions. MIPS also has different versions, etc. But we usually classify them as one ISA. So this slide is saying, okay, a good ISA lasts through many generations, which makes it very portable, meaning you can use old programs and still run them in newer systems, and provides convenient functionality to higher levels, permits efficient implementation, etc. Now, if you look at these, yes, x86, for instance, did last through many generations. No question about that. Was it a good ISA to provide efficient implementation? What do you think? Those of you who are familiar with the x86, yeah.
Did x86 less memory hungry compared to ARM? From the more power hungry, but in terms of memory,
In terms of program size, yes. That was kind of like I think what you were saying about the risk and sys. Yeah, clearly this this probably in this group this is the only.
aren't we going more towards ARM and those sorts of like lower power, more efficient processes, you really have the ability to have more memory.
Yeah, now we have the ability to have more memory, yes. Yeah. Many times success is not defined by being best. It's just company cloud also plays a big role. Intel was always having a monopoly, and they actually bought. They always would buy, any competitor they could. So, like Digital Equipment Corporation, they were having the Alpha processor, which were actually doing very well, but Intel bought that. So we cannot say x86 is a good ISA because it survived many generations. I mean, the reason for survival could be different. But so the slide is just saying in general, yeah. If but MIPS actually is still alive and kicking, but not in general purpose computing, but in the embedded systems, yes. I mean, there are still processors being made with the MIPS, for instance. ARM, yes, as we know, is certainly very popular instruction set. Okay, this is just going into MIPS. Okay. As I mentioned earlier today, we are more interested in quantitative principles or quantitative analysis, and there are 5 kind of quantitative principles that we look at. One is take advantage of parallelism. We actually have been talking about that. Then the second is principle of locality. That is, in any digital system, it just takes time for information to flow from one part of the system to another part of the system. So it is important to make use of locality. So let's say this is the whole system. You have some information here which you want at this point. It will take some amount of time for this information to travel and reach there. So what we need to do is, once the information has reached there, we need to try to make maximum use of that. So in other words, we need to minimize communication. That's a different way of saying that. Especially long distance communication, because it takes time to send information from one part to another. So take advantage of parallelism and take advantage of locality or minimize communication. And then the third is focus on the common case. This is because if you take a system, whether it's just a single chip or an entire system, etc., you just cannot, even though, as somebody pointed out, yes, you can have more memory, more this, everything. Even though that's the case, we just don't want to pile up a lot of hardware because multiple reasons. One thing in hardware design is big means slow. Okay, so if you have 2 systems, one is smaller, the other is bigger, everything else is approximately equal, that means the bigger system is going to be slower. Again, why? More time for signals to go from one place to another, that's just the sheer distance. Then capacitance in the circuit, wires, transistors, etc., they will slow things down. So, so you want to kind of make it as small as possible, but now you have a dilemma. Do you want to have a very fast implementation of a multiplier, or do you want to have more cache memory? So you have decided this is going to be your chip size. You can do a very sloppy design for a multiplier which will take very little space, but will be very slow. Okay, so should you go for a high speed but more complex multiplier, or should you just use the slow multiplier and use that extra space or cache memory? So these are the kind of design decisions that we have to make in real life when building a processor, a memory, or an integrated system. And so this principle states focus on the common case. So that means now there is no single answer. Okay? So depending on the target application domain, maybe the target domain has a lot of multiply operations going on. So you may want to put more effort to build a multiplier. Or if your target domain is such that multiplication is once in a while, no big deal, so then this is not the right investment. So you have to kind of think of that as more like real estate investment. You have a little bit of space. What's the best way to utilize that silicon to build your hardware? And this is where we do simulation-based studies. Because there's really no equation or no other ways of finding out. So we would use simulators to analyze the program. And then when you analyze, then you can kind of see is multiply happening a lot, or memory reference, and so bigger cache would help or not, etc. Then the fourth is called Amdahl's law, which again he was also from IBM. He gave a pessimistic view of multiprocessing. What he stated was is true. What he stated was that in a system or in a software, if you have both serial part and parallelizable part, the overall speed up will be determined or limited by the portion of the program that is strictly serial. I think it's a better way of stating that would be pictorial. Let's say this is our original situation. Approximately 50% is serial, and approximately 50% is highly parallelizable. Okay, so in the limit, if you put in a lot of resources, hopefully we can do this in 0 time, because it's a tremendous amount of parallelism. But this has no parallelism whatsoever. So in that case, you will eventually end up with, you threw a lot of resources to reduce this part. But ultimately, your overall speed up is going to be capped at about 2, a factor of 2, because your original execution time was this, your new execution time is approximately half of that. So that's what Amdahl's law states. I mean, there is an equation for that. We'll see that later. But this is in principle what he was saying. What he was saying was, don't focus too much on this. If you have a strictly serial part, do something to reduce that also. So if this can be reduced by thread level parallelism, we can bring it to 0, but this has no thread level parallelism. Do ILP or vector or whatever, you have to do something about this. Otherwise, we are throwing too many resources and not really going to get a big benefit out of that. And the last one here is the processor performance equation, which is an equation we will be using a lot here. That equation we just have two equations in this course. One is this, the other is on cache memory performance. So this states execution time for a program is the product of dynamic instruction count, how many instructions are executed, multiplied by, on the average, how many clock cycles does it take per instruction, multiplied by how much time is each clock. So it's a straightforward split up of the execution time. By the way, how do you compare the performance of two systems? Let's say we have two systems. More on this coming later, but briefly, if you have two systems A and B, how do you compare the performance? And companies have used different metrics to compare performance. One of them is MIPS, different MIPS than that. MIPS stands for million instructions per second. Okay, that one was microprocessor, so interlocked pipeline stages. That's what that is. Anyway, this is million instructions per second. This actually is, I remember the days when this was a metric. So they would say, okay, we have this new processor that has 10 MIPS or 100 MIPS, etc. What is wrong with this metric? Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't really say what type of instruction. I mean, if you look at this CISC and RISC, a CISC instruction may be accomplishing a lot more functionality than a RISC instruction. In fact, some of the x86 instructions are really weird, doing all sorts of complex things. And there was an architecture called VAX Yeah.
Yeah, could you explain what CISC and RISC is?
Oh, system is,
Yeah.
they stand for complex instruction set computer
Mm-hmm.
and reduced instruction set computer.
Right, thank you.
What that means is these will have only very simple instructions. That means each instruction is probably not doing much. Just get something from memory or write something to memory, things like that. Whereas CISC means you can have some very complex instructions, like go to those two memory locations, add them together and write that in memory. So that would be one instruction. Whereas that would get broken down into at least 3-4 instructions in this case. Yeah, and that's precisely the problem with this metric, because the metric does not really capture the effect of how much work is each instruction doing. So there have been other, and I think another very common metric that people use when buying computers is just the clock speed, right? Oh, this one is 2.7 gigahertz, that one is 3.7. So obviously the 3.7 gigahertz one should be faster. But it does not really tell the entire picture. So this is the right metric. How much time does it take to execute a program? And that depends on these three things. With cycle time being, or clock speed, this is a reciprocal of clock speed. Clock speed being just only one aspect in this equation here. So it is possible that one of them is running at 3.7 gigahertz, but it's taking many more cycles per instruction. The CPI may be very high, but we don't see that. I don't think anybody, any vendor really addresses any of these, right? I mean, this is anyway dependent only on the program and the compiler. This is dependent on the hardware. This is also dependent on the hardware. So from the hardware side, we are only seeing one picture here. Okay, so that's the fifth one here, the processor performance equation. These ideas were developed when performance was kind of considered to be the most important thing. Now in the late 90s, power consumption became very important. Why power is important? Yeah.
Well, if it consumes up so much battery in like 2 minutes, that's not like very good, is it? Or maybe, I'm sorry, maybe if you can go to efficiency.
Yeah, certainly. So, so what you're talking about is energy. Those two are related. So we talk about this is execution time for a program. Similarly, how much energy is consumed to execute a program. If more energy is consumed, then the battery drains faster, etc. Power is related to energy. Power is energy consumed in unit time. Generally, this is just very general. In battery operated devices, we are more concerned with energy and with things that we plug onto the outlet. We are more concerned with the power. But they are related, obviously. Yeah. We could talk about any of in any order, but let me talk about power. So let's say we are talking about a a system that's connected to an outlet. What would be the reason? Why are we concerned about power? Yeah.
I guess if we use more power, it's a good chance the project, the device, the computer itself will get hotter for a longer period of time. So it would affect the life cycle, the lifetime of the device.
Yeah. In fact, that's a long-term problem. The short-term problem, yeah.
Isn't it, aren't there membrane errors that can occur at very high temperatures?
Yeah, reliability. Yeah. The shorter term problem is reliability because power consumption needs heat. So you have to have some mechanism to remove the heat. Otherwise, the temperature would go up. So it's actually very expensive. In fact, one of the first supercomputers, Cray, this was one of the first supercomputers with very high computation power, and most of their patents were not on computer architecture, but their patents were on cooling technology because it was dissipating such a huge amount of power that all that heat needed to be removed. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So, so if you have that kind of a cooling technology, that means it's going to be very expensive. So, if you don't remove the heat, what happens is temperature goes up. Power, temperature, and reliability goes down. Plus, also the lifetime also goes down, especially when you have temperature cycles getting extremely hot and cooling down. Then, so if that happens, then long-term reliability is also impacted. So we want to avoid all that. So that's why power became very important. And I remember seeing some graph about year and heat density in processor chips, and I was kind of going again exponentially. This is log scale. And many years ago, itself, it became, the heat density became more than that of the cooking range. I was still going up, so that means you take that chip, the amount of power dissipated per unit area was more than what was generated in the cooking range, like that. So it reached a point where it was no longer sustainable. So it was kind of brought like that, and now even like that. So if you look at the ARM chips, for instance, they have really worked hard to bring the power density very low. Okay, I guess we can stop there. Continue.